So that's the cycle,
Can you repeat?
phases of a disaster. Where should I repeat?
Impact.
What did I say pre-impact is?
Impact is before the disaster, impact during the disaster, and post-impact is after the disaster.
So it's called phases of a disaster or disaster management cycle. I'll start with the pre-impact phase before the disaster. This time is time for disaster planning and mitigation before the actual occurrence. You plan in advance before the disaster. During this phase, the pre-impact phase, there is also assessment of probabilities and risks of occurrence. There's assessment of probabilities and risks of occurrence of a certain type of a disaster. So you do risk assessment and hazard vulnerability analysis or assessment during the pre-impact phase before the disaster. You also plan for specific actions. These plans are designed to reduce the effects of a predicted disaster. This plan we are talking about will be influenced on how a disaster will affect a community. I hope we are together. Before a disaster, you just predict that a disaster is going to occur. Before predicting this, you do assessment. This assessment is called a risk assessment or hazard vulnerability analysis or assessment. So after assessing, you plan for specific actions to reduce the impact or the effect of the predicted hazard. Your plans will depend on how a disaster is going to affect that community. I'm sure we are together on the before a disaster phase. You plan in advance, you predict, you assess, and then you plan for actions. These actions are there to reduce the impact that might come because of the effects of the disaster. And then the second phase is the impact phase. Impact phase. This is during the disaster. It occurs when the disaster is actually happening. This is the time of enduring hardship or injury, of trying to survive. The time of enduring hardship or injury because of trying to survive. Pardon? For INJURY, injury. Oh, you mean enduring? ENDURI. ENDU. So this impact phase might last for several minutes or hours or days or weeks, but it will depend on the nature of a hazard. If it's for a day, we can think of earthquakes or explosions. So people will try to survive. Nyumba yaka, that's a disaster. People will try to survive, but it will last for just some hours, some minutes, I can say. We can talk of, we're not talking of hours, days, or weeks. We can talk of floods, we can talk of epidemics. During this time, people try to survive. Imagine during Korea, we have endured a lot. We were putting masks everywhere, just trying to survive, not to catch the virus. Sanitizing everywhere. You go to this shop, you sanitize your hand. After 5 minutes, you sanitize your hand, just to try to survive. You also do, this phase, this occurring phase, it continues until the threat of further destruction has passed and the measures plan is in effect. So it continues until the destruction, the threat of a further destruction has passed and the measures plans are in effect. I'll keep using an example of coronavirus. People continue to put on masks. Even now, people are putting on masks. Okay? Even though we have the emergency plans are the putting on of masks. So it continues until it passes, until they will announce that COVID-19 is over. That's when it will stop. So you do a preliminary assessment of the nature during this period, the occurrence of a disaster. You do a preliminary assessment. Under this preliminary assessment, I'm sure we are together. You need to pay attention on this cycle. You do a preliminary assessment. In a preliminary assessment, you look at the nature of the disaster, the extent. You also look at the geographical area of the disaster, where the disaster is made. That's a preliminary assessment. Remember, we talked of risk assessment yesterday, whereby we looked at the nature of the hazard. We looked at how vulnerable the community is, or the area that is affected is, to that hazard. And lastly, we look at preparedness, how prepared people were for that disaster. Or we also look at the economic damage of that natural hazard. So it's the same with preliminary assessment. During the disaster, you have to consider the nature of the disaster. Is it floods? Is it earthquake? Of what extent? How long has that natural disaster lasted in that area or the affected area? How many, if you look at extent, how many people are affected with that disaster? What about the area? How vulnerable is the area to that disaster? That's a preliminary assessment. So you do it during the occurrence of a disaster, the impact phase. So in impact phase, you do three things. You rescue the people, whereby people are trying to survive. This may last for a minute, days, weeks. It continues until the destruction, until the threat of a further destruction has passed and the emergency plan is in effect. Remember, you planned in the pre-impact. So you implement those plans during the disaster. you implement. As you're implementing these plans, you also do assessment, preliminary assessment. That is done on impact phase. I'm sure we are together. Then we have a post-impact phase. Post-impact phase, after the disaster. This phase has got two components. We have the emergency phase and the recovery phase. Emergency phase and recovery phase. Post-impact phase, emergency phase. So this phase begins at the end of the impact phase and ends when there is no longer any immediate threats of injury or destruction. So it begins at the end of the impact phase and ends when there is no longer any immediate threat of injury or destruction. So soon as a natural event occurs, I'll use an example of earthquake. Earthquake yabangika yata yangota. It's when this pre-impact phase come in, just at the end of the impact phase, emergency phase. During emergency phase, you rescue and provide first aid. Ndemu kuona ndi kuzokadiyo yambirira. Okay, nyumba yapya, moto uja wangota, you rescue and provide first aid. Chifukwa chani kunazo tukangota moto? Because we are saying that the impact phase, the first phase, the second phase is the phase of hardship and endurance, whereby people are trying to survive. So you come in and rescue. Rescuing is under post-impact phase, but the first phase in post-impact. And then we have recovery phase. This recovery phase begins during the emergency phase and ends when the return of normal community order and functioning. Begins during the emergency phase and ends with the return of normal community order and the functioning. Remember, disaster is the disruption of the functioning of the community. So in post-impact phase, after impact phase, the recovery phase come in soon as the emergency phase is done. So you try to provide people with their normal communities. There's rescue and first aid in post-impact. The evacuation plans, okay, they fall under this emergency plans. Okay. So in recovery phase, you try to let them to build a normal community whereby it will be able to function as a community. So the disaster plan cycle should begin during this phase. So I can say that that cycle is continuous. You don't stop because the community is now functioning. No. You prepare for the next phase, for the next disaster. You plan in advance. So it's a continuous cycle. That's a disaster management cycle. You go back to the pre-impact phase. You go back and do assessment, plan in advance. Then disaster when give us, you go and rescue, the most impact. So it's a continuous cycle. Also, the fact that for 5 years, area seen about affecting the disaster and then also see, you keep on planning. Question? It ends when the return of a normal community order and functioning.
When they return.
Yes, in the normal community order and functioning. Since when there's a disaster, a community stops functioning the way it was functioning, okay? It's not only about rescuing people, evacuating people. It can be the same community but stop functioning. So in the recovery phase, you try as much as possible for the community to start functioning as a community. So when you see that this community is now functioning the way it was, that's where the recovery phase ends. So you make sure that people are now going to work, people are able to move up and down, people are able to meet, to do meetings. That's when you see that I think this community is now in order and it's functioning. So the recovery phase ends there. I'll revise whatever we discussed for today. We started with disaster. I didn't define a disaster because we already did last week, so I skipped. We started with the types of a disaster. Say that there are 2 types of disasters. We have natural disasters and man-made disasters. Natural disasters are caused by natural events. Example, we have tornadoes. Tornadoes are violent storms with very strong circular winds over a small area. We talked of flash floods, blizzards. Blizzards are severe snowstorms with strong winds. We talked of slow rising floods, earthquakes, epidemics, volcanic eruptions as examples of natural disasters. I defined man-made disasters. They are caused by man-made activities. Examples include wars, chemicals, transportation accidents. This transportation accident can include air accidents, water, and road accidents. I talked of food and water contamination, construction accidents, building collapse, fire. They are under man-made disasters. Then we looked at characteristics of a disaster. So disasters are characterized into 3. One of the characteristics is number of casualties. Casualties, a casualty is a human being or a person who is injured or killed by or as a direct result of an incident or a natural hazard. So these casualties are classified into 2. We have multiple casualty incident and mass casualty incident. A multiple casualty incident includes 2 people, but not more than 100. That's a multiple. When saying of a mass casualty, it's 100 and above. CA, SU, A, L, T, Y. And on the Mass Kazaya Day, I said that a community is supposed to prepare for it. Proceeding with the characteristics of disasters. The second one is the scope of the disaster. A scope is the range of its effect. A range of its effect, either geographically or it can be in terms of the number of victims. The range of its effect, either geographically or in terms of the number of victims. The scope. I gave an example of a bus accident with 100 people died. And compare that with a collapse of a bridge while two cars are crossing. So it is this road accident that have got a greater scope than a collapsed bridge. The impact, the range of its effect. So that's the scope of the disaster. Another characteristic is the intensity of the disaster. When we're looking at intensity, we are looking at the level of destruction and devastation that is caused by disaster. I gave an example of an earthquake, whereby think of an earthquake that is centered on the city, centered in a city, and an earthquake that is centered in a community, just a mere community. Or we can say a remote area. An earthquake that is centered in a city will have a greater intensity than that in a remote area. Why? Because there will be a lot of things that will be destroyed by the same earthquake in a city compared to a remote area. That was the last characteristic of a disaster. Then we looked at the factors contributing to disasters. One of the factors is a host factor. A host is a human being who experiences the disaster. A host is a human being who experiences a disaster. So I looked at several factors when we're talking of a host. We considered age, general health, mobility, psychological factors, and socioeconomic factors. These are some of the factors which contribute to the likelihood of experiencing a disaster. Another factor is agent factor. The agent is the nature or technological element that causes the disaster. When looking at agent, we are looking at element that causes a disaster. It can be natural or technological. So I gave an example of a volcanic eruption. For a volcano to occur, for volcanic eruption to occur, it is caused by lava. So here, a lava is an agent factor. We're talking of accidents, road accidents, water accidents, air accidents. It is because of the irresponsibility of a driver, air hostess. So if they are irresponsible, that will end in an accident. If someone is failing to adhere to the safety policies, maybe of road or construction, that can end into a disaster. So when looking at agent factor, we are looking at the element that causes the disaster. So these are the factors contributing to a disaster. The last one was the environmental factor. These are factors that could potentially contribute or mitigate a disaster. If a community is failing to prepare, that means that community is contributing to a disaster because it is failing to prepare. In an area, you find out that there are presence of flood-prone rivers. That's a contributing factor. And then we finished with the phases of a disaster. The pre-impact, the impact, and the post-impact. PHASE. It is called a phase of a disaster. Or disaster management cycle. We have the pre-impact, that's before a disaster, whereby you do assessment, risk assessment, vulnerability assessment. Then you design specific action plans. These specific action plans are designed to reduce the effects of a predicted disaster. Your plan will be influenced by it will be influenced on how a disaster will affect a community. So you predict, you forecast, and then you come up with a plan. Then you have the impact phase, the occurring phase during the disaster. People endure hardship, injury for trying to survive. It lasts for minutes, hours, weeks, days. This phase continues until the destruction has passed and the emergency plans are in effect. The plans that you had during the preparation phase. You do preliminary assessment. Your preliminary assessment should include the nature of the disaster, the extent of the damage of the disaster, geographical area where the disaster has occurred. You look at how vulnerable this area is to disasters. And lastly is the post-impact phase. This phase has got two components, emergency phase and recovery phase. Emergency phase is the time of rescue and first aid. It begins at the end of the impact phase. And then we have the recovery phase. That begins during the emergency phase and ends when the return of a normal functioning of the community is in order. And then you start the cycle again. You can say it's a continuous cycle. If you have questions, you can ask. Yes.
You say disaster phase is also called what?
Disaster phase? I didn't mention about disaster phase. There is no disaster phase. Which phase are you asking about? There are three phases. Pre, post, and those are the phases. We don't have a disaster phase.
You don't get what I'm saying, madam. So I would see when I have already the phases of the disaster is also called what?
I said there are three phases. The pre-impact, that is before disaster. The impact is during disaster. And the post-impact is after the disaster.
Yes, and then we are still now, we are proposing defense here, much bigger, so we are not going.
It is also called disaster management, say. It's called a disaster management. So I have last work for you. With time, you have to submit this on Friday next week. I will not come to teach, I'll just come to collect your assignments. It's not an assignment necessarily, it's a class work that is, but still you need to submit because I have to see. You will not come to learn, or you can bring any day or before Friday. Time anymore in the class you can come and submit, but before or Friday when the class in any day, okay? Much as you complete your work fast. You need to do a risk assessment or a vulnerability assessment. You need to go out there and assess. It can be people, it can be communities, it can be companies that are at risk. Mention what is at risk, okay? You have to mention it. State how vulnerable that thing is to a hazard. I'm sure we're together.
Yes.
State how vulnerable that thing is to a disaster. State the socio-economic value of that thing that is at risk. The value of that thing at risk. Being it a road, what's its value to the community? Being it a company, what's the value of that thing? We are doing a risk assessment. So the topic should be risk assessment or vulnerability assessment. So after identifying the value of that thing at risk, you need to go back to disaster, we call it warning system. We discussed about warning system yesterday. Under warning system, we looked at the elements. So you go back to those elements. If so you go back to yesterday's notes. Look at early warning system. I think we defined warning systems. We talked of elements. There were 4 elements. Under those elements, just focus on one element. That element that is talking of forecasting the possible impact of a hazard. So after the last thing is that you need to forecast possible impact of that thing at risk to a certain hazard. So this will be the end of our class today.